Hello, and welcome to this episode of Through the Gunsights. In response to your feedback and your questions, this time we've decided to take a little bit of a step away from development and talk more about the history of 83, why our history exists, the way it works with real Cold War history, and the reasons for why this is the period that we selected. As you're probably aware, Andrew Garland wrote a paper that was mentioned by one of our team earlier regarding the most dangerous year in history. There are a lot of flashpoints in this period, and points where the world could, in theory, have been thrown into a huge world war. Now, there are a number of reasons why it wasn't, but they do influence the way our alternate version plays out. And so, when you look at things like the destruction of Korean Airlines 007, when you look at things such as ghost warnings for missile radars that were not responded to because a cool head presided, those are some of the areas where, in our world, went a little bit differently. The story of the most dangerous year in history begins with Ronald Reagan. To those of you who are aficionados of the period will be aware, there was somewhat of a policy of mutually assured destruction. And that was something that Reagan, along with obviously a lot of other people, were not keen on. As a result, the US government began to look at various ways that they could potentially break that deadlock. In 1980, with the end of the détente policy, the government began funding countries who'd struggled under the yoke of communism, attempting to stoke rebellions in a policy known as the Reagan Doctrine. And in 1981, Reagan increased the pressure, sending funds and military aid to the Mujahideen, rebels fighting against the USSR in Afghanistan. No doubt these actions served to ramp up the tensions with the Soviet Union, and with the death of Brezhnev, reports leaked to Reagan's ears that there was a power struggle in the Kremlin. And this power struggle ended with the victory of Andropov. It's around this time that Reagan began to further ramp up the anti-Soviet doctrine, labelling them totalitarian evil and the evil empire. And the Soviet Union replied by labelling the speeches as a fit of anti-Soviet bellicose hysteria. So now we come to the three events, any one of which could have plunged the world into World War III, a nuclear holocaust across the globe. So in the first case, Able Archer, which was a NATO exercise, which of course increased friction dramatically. These aren't in date order. Secondly, the destruction of KAL 007, which is a Boeing 747 filled with civilians, thought to be a spy plane by the Russians. Its destruction, with the loss of all on board, both crew and passengers, brought international condemnation. The incident that we like to focus on, in which we start to see a strong deviation, is that of Stanislav Petrov, a Russian officer who was responsible for monitoring inbound threats of a nuclear type. He elected to notice that signs that he saw of an attack were a glitch. Rather than following protocol, he decided not to respond. What would have happened if he'd had a bad day? Or perhaps if someone from the party had been visiting? Perhaps things would have played out differently. And what of the Star Wars system? Did it exist? Was there an opportunity for mutually assured destruction to be something that no longer existed in the way it was? These are some of the events that trigger our version of a new timeline.
So now you know why we chose the year 1983. But a broader question some of you might now be asking is, why choose the Cold War at all? Why choose a fictional war in the first place? Well, there's a couple of reasons here. When we first started discussing settings for the game that would eventually become 83, the first thing we decided was that we wanted to do something new, not just retread the same ground over and over. So immediately, a Cold War turned hot scenario was a really appealing option, not just because it's a new era for us, but also because it's a setting that so few games have ever really touched upon, despite the richness of options for content. But the Cold War also lasted for decades, so we had to choose a smaller piece to represent. Now, as many of you would be aware, our last title was actually set right in the middle of the Cold War, albeit the proxy war in Vietnam. And although our new game would not be a Vietnam War game, had we chosen the 1960s or 70s, then the game really would have just been the same thing anyway, albeit with a different skin on it. And that's not something we wanted to do. If we tried to go earlier than Vietnam, then things aren't too different to the Second World War, which we've also already covered quite extensively in the past. So that left us with the natural option of the 1980s, and let's be honest here, that is the first thing that most people think of when you say the words Cold War. And of course, as we covered earlier, that was the point when things came their closest to actual direct conflict. So by pushing forward to a new period of time that we've never touched on as a studio before, it lets us work on something that's fresh, exciting and new, which is a really motivating factor for our team. But not only that, it's also an era brimming with possibilities. The range of things that we can choose from to include in the game is staggering, and at the same time, crucially, it's at a point in history when advanced weapon technology was still in its infancy. So that lets us include more recognisably modern weapons, vehicles, features than in our past games. But at the same time, it also means that we don't have to worry about an overabundance of things like weapon attachments, optics, aiming aids, and the like. Of course, these things did exist, but not in such numbers that their inclusion might risk breaking the formula that has been so successful for us in past titles. So, in short, choosing a 1980s Cold War setting for this game lets us explore new ground and stretch our creative legs, while still being able to retain the flow, the gunplay, and of course, our dedication to historical authenticity that the community has rightfully come to expect from the games that we make.
So thank you for joining us for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit of Cold War history that maybe you didn't know, but maybe you did. But more importantly, about what we're doing with this and our reasons for doing what we're doing with this. 83 for us is a work of passion and something that we believe is a unique opportunity for us to carry this incredible moment in our world history forward in a slightly different direction. If you'd like to read about the paper that we mentioned earlier, you can find a link to the PDF here, along with links to our own social media, which of course I encourage you to join up and stay in touch through. So, all that remains is to wish you well, stay safe, and I'll see you on the battlefield. We're currently working on 83 and IGI Origins in an extremely busy period, which is made far worse by the issue of COVID-19. So, we want to set expectations that our next Through the Gunsights video will be with you this August. We know there's a gap and we're very sorry about that, but we would much rather put the extra work into the game to focus on delivering that rather than trying to stretch ourselves in this challenging time. Thank you.